So at this point, we have successfully replicated the functionality of our component did mount lifecycle method in our new hooks-based functional component by using useEffect. The other half of the functionality that we have to account for is component did update. As a reminder, in our previous implementation, right here, we checked for a change in the value of the search term piece of state. And if it had changed, we then issue this request right here to our backend and provide the query for our JSON server to filter by. So we're going to apply this exact same code right now. And as it turns out, we're going to be able to use a single effect to accomplish this query as well. So if I scroll up, we're not going to need to add any new useEffect calls. We're just going to stick with our original one here. And right here, I'm going to provide that configuration object. That's going to be the second argument to the get method. And it's going to be an object with a params property set to another object. And that object will need a parameter of Q that is short for query, and that is just a JSON server implementation detail. And query expects the actual string that JSON server will use to filter data from at that endpoint. So when we are hitting this employee's endpoint, we can provide the search term that the user has typed in. And right now we don't have this.state, but we do have access to that search term right here as a regular constant because we are getting it from useState. And we can utilize the benefit of JavaScript closures, which means we can use this search term constant within the body of this function completely fine. Any function has access to any constants or variables declared in an outer scope. So we are totally welcome to use search term right here. Okay, and the beautiful part about this is going to work for the initial request as well, because when the component renders, search term will be equal to an empty string. And when we send a Q property set to an empty string, JSON server says, you have not given me anything to filter by, so I'm just going to give you the regular batch of employees. So upon initial render, if I refresh this page, everything still works, okay? And then as we saw earlier in the course from our component did update code, this code should work just fine, assuming that search term is updated to be whatever the user has just typed. But as it turns out, this is currently not going to be a working implementation. So check out what happens when I type a character, for example, D or W or I or G or H. It turns out nothing is happening. So what is going on here? Well, as we can see right here, we have a little bit of an ESLint warning in VS Code. And if I hover my mouse over it, it says React Hook useEffect has a missing dependency search term. Either include it or remove the dependency array. So what's the problem here? Well, remember what we did in the previous lesson. We added an array here, and that array represents the pieces of state that effect should watch or monitor in order to update. So we provided an empty array, which communicates to this effect that no state change, no piece of state changing should trigger this effect to run again. It is only going to run once after the component's initial render. So the problem is when the user types a character in here, we are indeed updating the search term piece of state. That is happening right here on line 39. We are providing that arrow function that is using set search term to set the next value of that state. So search term is indeed updating. But the problem is because we have an empty array here, we have told React never to run this effect again. So what we need to do is to add the piece of state that we want to care about to this array. And of course, that piece of state is going to be search term. So now what we're saying is, useEffect, please run this function once after the component renders, and then anytime that search term changes, we want you to rerun this function again. That is what this array represents, the pieces of state that should trigger the effect to rerun. Now, it's very important that we do not put the employee's piece of state in here, or we will create the exact same infinite loop problem that we saw in the previous lesson. Because if we put employees in here, then what's going to happen is we're going to make the API request. We're going to get a new batch of employees. We're going to set the employee's slice of state, right? Which is going to be listed here in that scenario, which means useEffect will say, you told me to monitor employees. It has now been changed, so I need to rerun this effect. And that will create an infinite loop. Here, we're going to avoid this problem because we're going to tell React to only rerun this effect when search term changes, and search term is going to change every time the user types a character. And since search term is not actually being changed anywhere in here, we're not going to trigger an infinite loop. Search term is going to be the thing that kicks everything off, right? But the actual piece of state we're modifying in this function is employees. And so we're not going to have any kind of infinite loop problems. So once again, let me save this. And it looks like everything is working, but let's start from the very beginning and I'll walk you through the entire process. So when the page loads, the effect will run once. That is guaranteed no matter what our second argument is to useEffect. This will run automatically after the component renders. So we make our first request with the queue property here set to the initial value of search term, which is an empty string. That fetches us all the original employee cards, or more specifically, the employee objects, which then we iterate over to render the cards. Then we type a character like D. What happens when we type D is we update the search term piece of state by using the set search term function right here, right? Then React says, okay, I'm going to monitor all of my effects. Is there any effects that have been told to watch out for the value of search term changing? And we say, yes, we told React to monitor search term whenever it changes. So React says search term has changed, so now I need to rerun this logic again. So it reruns this function, but this time around, search term is updated to be whatever the user typed. In this case, it's now a string with a capital D. So we now make another network request to our JSON server. JSON server returns the new employees array of 3 objects. We save that to our employee state. That triggers a re-render, and that allows us to see 3 cards on the screen. And that process repeats with every additional character that the user types into here. Okay? So just to review everything we've learned so far, there are 3 ways that you can use useEffect, and the differences between them all depend on the second argument, right? If we use useEffect and we only provide a function with no second argument, no array whatsoever, that means useEffect will run after the component renders, and then it will also run on every single state change, right? That was the first issue we encountered. Because we did not have any kind of array, we ran on every single state change, which means every time we set employees, that was a state change, and we triggered a rerunning of the effect. So by default, if you only provide a function to useEffect, the effect will rerun on any piece of state changing in the component. That is option number 1. Option number 2 is we provide an empty array. An empty array means we are not tracking any pieces of state, so there is no piece of state changing that will trigger the effect to run again. With that said, it will always run once because it's going to run an initial time after the component renders. So every effect is going to run at least once, but an empty array says don't ever run it again because there's no piece of state changing that should trigger rerunning again, right? That's option 2. So option 1 is just the function. Option 2 is the function with an empty array. And option 3 is the function with an array with some pieces of state. And it can be 1, it can be 2, it can be however many you need. But those pieces of state have to matter because those pieces of state are going to indicate when React is going to run the effect. So in this case, we are telling React, if search term changes, please rerun the function that we passed right here. We do not want to include employees here because that will trigger an infinite loop, right? And different effects may care about different pieces of state, and so you can customize each effect to run as needed depending on what pieces of state that it cares about. That maybe it will care about one thing, but it will not care about another thing, while the second effect you have may be vice versa. It may care about another piece of state, but not care about the first piece of state, etc., right? So that, again, is the complete API of useEffect, and those are the 3 ways that you can use it. It's always going to run at least once, but then you can customize whether it never runs again, whether it always runs on every state change, or the specific state properties that should trigger a state change. So with this, I think we have completely mimicked or replicated the original functionality of our employee registry, so everything should be working as expected, and it indeed does look that way. All right, so with that said, I will see you in the next lesson.